Okay. Well, I am so excited about today. What a treat. Quick intro. I think you all know me, but I'm Allison Campbell. I'm the founder of unBurnt. And my mission, I'm so excited, is to, help people and companies break free from chronic stress. And there's a number of ways, particularly in the environment we're in, continuing post-pandemic to sort of figure out what that means inside of workplaces, what that means in practice for people. Just so excited to be digging in a number of ways. And one of those ways is bringing experts, really interesting programming to the community and making just the topic of burnout more approachable. Something that we can all, whether it's learning how to mitigate stress in our everyday life, doing a deep dive in the neuroscience like we are today. I'm so excited, taking away those actionable tips. My goal is to bring experts, the research, expertise across all these different wellness domains to you all, bring the benefit of all of these amazing leaders and innovators that I'm meeting and I'm learning from along the way. And, just so fortunate that Michele agreed to join us today. So by way of intro, Michele, this is Dr. Michele Veldsman. She and I met through a founding women's community, and we clicked right away. And I was just so intrigued, so interested in the work she's doing. And so she's a neuroscientist by trade. I'll let her provide a bit more detail in terms of what that means, it looks like from a day-to-day basis. But she's also the founder of a company called Playroom. She's based in the UK, and she's building out this brain-based parenting app. There's also a component that connects families, connects parents, which is such a key focus when you're in the early years of raising your kids and trying to find your way. Community is so important. So I'll let her do a more thorough and a deeper dive in terms of her intro, but just again, so thrilled she joined us today. We're going to kick it off. Michele, I'll hand it over to you for an intro and then we'll get into it.
Okay, thank you. Let me just share my screen first.
And while you're doing that, Michele, sorry, one other call out. I'm going to monitor the chat. So as we're going, if there are questions, I'll sort of keep watch, and we'll try to either interject or save them, if there's a natural moment of pause. But do feel free to pop questions in along the way. Michele has said that she's happy to do Q&A as we go through.
Okay, I just want to check you're all okay to see my screen. And it's the main slides, all fine, yeah? Okay, excellent. So I want to talk to you today about the neuroscience of burnout and your brain on the motivation to apathy axis. So I'll tell you a bit more about my background, but I want to start with a mindfulness exercise that I think is really helpful. And it's particularly when you're feeling very stressed or overwhelmed. There's a couple of things that you can say and do to just bring yourself to be present. So maybe we'll start with that, if that's all right with everyone. You can just do some box breathing or just do a couple of deep breaths. Close your eyes if you like, or keep them open, it's up to you. But really, we just want to breathe in. And let all the stresses out. And then you can either say these phrases under your breath or in your mind. They're good things to keep on board, to just bring yourself present whenever you're feeling very stressed and overwhelmed. Nothing to fix, safe and protected, contented and peaceful in the midst of this experience. Safe and protected in the midst of this experience. Nothing to fix, safe and protected. Okay. And hopefully that's allowed you to just center yourself a little bit. Let go of the major stresses that you're holding. If you find you're hugely overwhelmed and stressed, it's a really good one to come back to. Okay, let's see. So Alison gave me a great introduction there. I did a PhD in cognitive neuroscience at the University of Cambridge, and then I studied the brain for almost 20 years. It says I am Director of Neuroscience at Cambridge Cognition. That's no longer true. I realized I didn't have an intro, so I copied this off my website, which I now realize is out of date. But essentially, I've been studying the brain for a very long time. I specifically around burnout and motivation, I studied motivation and apathy in a range of neurological patients and in healthy people to understand how it works in our brain. So today I really want to take you through what is motivation. And the reason we're talking about motivation is because one of the core aspects or symptoms of burnout is a lack of motivation. So it's the apathy. So we really want to understand motivation in the brain so that we can understand what happens when you burn out and you lose that motivation. Then how do we maintain motivation without burning out? And then how do we recognize burnout and what can we do about it? So often when we think about motivation, you see these kind of Instagram quotes of like things that basically bring to mind this idea that you have to focus, put a lot of effort in, and just keep doing that until you get to your success, right? And that is helpful in the short term, but it doesn't really tell us how to get and keep motivated, and really what it takes to stay at a healthy level of effort without burning ourselves out. And when we talk in psychology and neuroscience, when we talk about motivation, when we talk about motivation generally, we mean it in a much more specific term. So really what we're talking about is self-initiated or goal-directed behavior. So it's not kind of just the like airy quotes, it's a very specific thing. And the reason that we study it is that it teaches us a lot about what happens when motivation goes away. So when people are apathetic, which is very common in neurological disorders or indeed in burnout. We also helps us understand how some people can be very motivated, other people less motivated, how we can get people to that level of motivation and how we can use our neurobiology to help us kind of optimize our decision making. But like everything in human behavior, it's very, very complex. So at its core, it's about decision making, right? Motivation is rooted in decision making. So if you think about something that you are trying to get motivation to do, maybe like just going for a run, if you look at this diagram, there's a number of processes that are going on at the same time. And I'm going to show you now just the kind of psychological part, and then that relates to how it's working in the brain. So first of all, you have to make a decision that you want to go for a run, right? So now you have to consider a variety of contexts. First, there's your homeostatic context. So maybe you had a very bad sleep, you're really tired, you've got to decide, okay, is it going to be worth it to do this now? Then there's the environmental context, and that could be like, you know, that it's raining and it's cold outside. Do I want to go out in this weather? Then you have option generation. So this is when you decide, oh, do I want to go for a run now? Or do I want to, maybe I'll do it later when it's not raining, maybe I'll do it tomorrow. And these are all things that are going into your decision to basically get to a behavior. And those things might not be conscious, but these are all of the things that your brain is doing to get you from the motivation to the behavior. Now, even when you've decided, okay, I'm going to go for a run, you get out there halfway through your run, you're like, oof, I don't know, am I feeling this? Is it worth it? Now you're evaluating, should I keep running? Should I keep going? Or should I quit here? This is all part of this process. I don't know if I've got a little thing here that you can you see my mouse? Okay, so yeah, we're basically in this circle of, is it worth it? I'm constantly making these evaluations, and there's these pressures around. And then once you've gone for that run, you've now kind of updated your brain's prediction of like, is this actually something that was valuable to do? Did I get that kind of reward from it that I was expecting? Maybe it's that runner's high, or was it just really awful? So that when I need to make that decision again, all of these things are playing in. So that's the kind of complex situation that we're working with. And at the heart of that is the fact that we are individually evaluating things based on effort and reward. Now, some people are very effort sensitive, some people are very reward sensitive. If you're effort sensitive, it means that, you know, the effort to do something, you're going to need a larger reward to put that effort in. And conversely, if you're reward sensitive, it might be that you put any effort in just for the smallest reward. And those things vary by person, by situation, by context, by decision. So that's a really important thing to bear in mind, just generally in terms of motivation. And of course, that's going to change in terms of circumstance. So, for example, if it's really cold and raining outside, maybe you don't want to go out. This is really January specific. It's very cold and rainy here. So maybe you would go out and meet a friend, but you wouldn't feel like going for a run because the reward would be greater than seeing your friend versus getting that activity. So that's really specific. And conversely, if you're ill, then that's going to change things. And I just mean like maybe you have flu, that's going to change your motivation for doing things. But actually also in neurological and psychiatric disorders, that comes into play. And in fact, in burnout, it changes the way that you're evaluating things in terms of effort and reward. So we know that there are a number of brain regions that are implicated in this entire process, and that goes from whether when you're evaluating rewards, you're making decisions, you're integrating all of that information about effort and reward, along with your individual evaluation of whether this is something that is worth the effort, right? And some of these brain regions you might be familiar with. A lot of the so-called reward circuitry that's often talked about when it comes to things like addiction, and it's often quoted for everything from like being addicted to Oreo cookies. Genuinely, there's been a story about being addicted to Oreo cookies, to screen time, to everything. It's this reward processing circuitry. But it also does involve frontal cortex, frontal circuitry, which is where the decisions are being made. So all of these things are being integrated into your decision making to motivate you to enact a particular behavior. So that brings us to how do you get motivated and how do you keep motivated? Really, we want to optimize our brain for decision making, and most of that comes from just being healthy, all the traditional things. We often say healthy heart is a healthy brain, because all of the cardiovascular risk factors are in fact also cerebrovascular risk factors. So the things that make your heart unhealthy also make your brain unhealthy, because your brain needs that fresh flow of blood to make good decisions. And anything that is counteracting that is going to result in poor decision making and a lack of motivation. So exercise, both aerobic and weightlifting, anaerobic, is very important for fresh blood flow, to keep your brain healthy, essentially. And this is an interesting one because, of course, there's a kind of circular relationship in which your motivation might be down, so you don't feel like exercising, when in fact exercise might be the thing that really helps your motivation. The other thing, of course, is diet. Now, we now have an overwhelming amount of evidence to say the Mediterranean diet, vegetables, fruits, beans, nuts, cereals, grains, fish, all of that, very important for keeping cholesterol down, weight managed, mind healthy, brain healthy. So again, really important, healthy brain, healthy heart, healthy brain. And then sleep. Sleep is an interesting one because one that very often gets neglected, especially in people burning out because of this, of overwork. But it's the most counterproductive thing you can do is to not get good sleep. It's really absolutely so integral to your brain function. If you're trying to achieve any kind of goal, or you're trying to learn something new. Sleep is absolutely vital because, that's when consolidation happens. So the things that you learn, you're just not going to consolidate as well if you're sleep deprived. We now have so much evidence that your decision making, your speed of processing, your ability to do anything under sleep deprivation is just completely destroyed. So any kind of thought that you have that you're doing better by working longer and sleeping less, completely counterproductive. And in fact, there's always these kind of tales of people who are sleeping 4 hours a day and being hyperproductive. But in fact, when we look at the evidence, 7 hours is the minimum that we need to remain cognitively at peak. And anything below that, you're actually, doing yourself a disservice. And so really, we talk about sleep hygiene, which is getting as much light as possible in the morning, napping 20 minutes maximum if you are having sleep deprivation problems, so that you don't throw out your circadian and homeostatic cycles, exercising in the morning or in the daytime, not too close to bedtime. Try to keep a healthy weight to avoid any breathing problems that result in very poor sleep. And then if you have difficulty getting to sleep, so we think of sleep as your ability to get to sleep and then stay asleep for good quality sleep, then you can try mindfulness or cognitive shuffling. So mindfulness, you might do a kind of simple body scan exercise where you're with my kids, I get them to, we listen to a mindfulness podcast where you imagine sleep magic coming in at the tips of your toes, and then it has to touch every single part of your body all the way up to the tip of your head. Sometimes I think of somebody painting me. If they were to paint me blue, I would have to imagine every single part of my body that's getting painted to really be completely present in my body. The other thing is cognitive shuffling works very well. So there you start with a random word like bread. You take the last letter of that, D, dog, and then you take the last letter of that, G, girl, last letter of that, and that gives your brain enough to focus your attention without your anxieties and worries kind of blurring. So if you go to bed and you've got like 1,000 things on your mind, try that exercise. And you don't have an attention span long enough big enough, to cover the anxiety and doing that exercise. Now, stress is obviously the thing that's going to demotivate you, and this is where we start to get into burnout. Stress can be a really powerful motivator because at its core, it's our body's response to threat, right? So you get this high level of stress, then you have adrenaline, and this is an important thing to get you moving quickly, but at a sustained level, obviously has very negative effects on performance, physiological effects, psychological effects. These things are the things that ultimately lead to burnout. And you can't maintain performance under chronic stress. You just can't. Absolutely every piece of evidence suggests that. Any markers of chronic stress are highly correlated with negative performance. So even though you might be trying to push through it, ultimately you're going to see long-term effects on both your performance and physiologically. If we think about what the actual stress response is, there's the release of cortisol and adrenaline that drives the stress response. Helpful in the short term, as I said, because what's happening in the short term is this release of glucose into the bloodstream, reduce insulin release, increase energy temporarily. But ultimately, what you're doing is resulting in this like poor insulin responses in the long run, so that you're becoming more insulin resistant, and that all of those things are very bad for the brain long term. You also then have cortisol and adrenaline that's increasing heart rate and blood pressure. That's resulting in, suppression of immune response. All of these things that we learn about in fight and flight is that slowing down your digestion, all of those things chronically are very, very bad. So the problem is that all of those things are things that increase your risk of heart disease, cardiovascular disease, mental health, sleep. And the big problem is most of those things you can't detect. So things like blood pressure, you can't tell that your blood pressure is going up. Most people can't. Same with insulin resistance. So it's, even if you physiologically feel fine and you push through it for years, it's going to come back and get you. So let's talk about understanding apathy and recognizing burnout. So we started with motivation because the flip side of motivation is apathy. So that's just a lack of motivation. It is a clinical symptom of a number of neurological disorders. I studied those. So this is how I first came into studying motivation and decision making, is that we studied it across a variety of different neurological diseases and psychiatric problems. And it actually separates into different aspects of social, emotional and behavioral apathy. So it could be that you're apathetic to seeing other people. It could be that you're apathetic to emotion, so you start to have a kind of flatter affect, or it could be behavioral, so you just lose interest in things, you're just apathetic to doing things. Comes along with anhedonia, which is just the lack of interest in doing things that you previously enjoyed. And it is, of course, the core symptom of burnout. As you may or may not know, burnout was kind of coined by the psychologist Herbert Freudenberger, who noticed that these normally really dedicated, compassionate mental health workers were suddenly like showing this total loss of motivation, emotionally drained, very cynical, because I began to resent their patients. And so he coined this phrase of burnout, which really refers to this emotional exhaustion, physical fatigue, cognitive weariness, and it comes from chronic stress in the workplace. It is ICD-10 recognized medical disorder. So it usually occurs when there's a job, when your job demands outweigh your ability to cope with the stress, essentially. And even though we generally think of it in terms of people with high risk, high stress jobs, it of course occurs in all situations when you have a number of key factors that we'll go over. And also even in caring positions like parents and people who are caring for loved ones. So yeah, it's not just a case of working too hard or not being able to meet the demands of your job, which really underlies a lot of the stigma. It's really associated with both personal factors, but also organizational factors. And I'm sure Alison is an expert on those. But the core feelings are this feeling of apathy and demotivation, tired, drained, feeling helpless, trapped or defeated, having a cynical or negative outlook, self-doubt, procrastination. That's a big one that people often recognize first, and then feeling very overwhelmed. And the core features of it, which we use to help us understand how to protect ourselves against it, is that the workload for a given time is too high. So the extent of work just doesn't fit with your personal life, your social pressures, being able to maintain physical health, so getting enough time to exercise, to eat well, to sleep enough. Control is a huge one. So having a sense of control over your life is a like fast route to burnout. So not having enough autonomy within your job. Reward, so not having any recognition for your efforts. That one kind of fits with a lot of parents because you're like, you know, working so hard to try and keep your kids healthy and happy, and absolutely no recognition for that whatsoever. Community, so yeah, having people around you, having fulfilling relationships in your workplace, having a sense of fairness, that you know people are treated equally. And then values, this consistency between your personal values and your professional and your profession. So this you might recognize as cognitive dissonance, and that is very taxing on the brain. It's this idea that what you want to do versus what you're doing is misaligned. Decision making in general is effortful for the brain, essentially. So it's going to try and, you know, do as little as it can to get past those things. Okay, so a bit of self-reflection. So these are things that we consider when we model computationally how people make decisions, and that's related to their motivation, right? Literally, this is the kind of components that go into how we understand motivation and apathy in the brain. And number one is the effort worth the reward? And when we talk about reward, we don't just mean in like financial terms or something tangible now. It's also associated with your values or your recognition of your efforts, or even the smallest things, right? It's just whether the effort is worth the reward. So that's always worth reflecting on. Are your rewards tangible? Sometimes we have very far distant goals, and then we have a problem with temporal discounting, where the reward becomes less valued the further away it is. So quite often, if you ask people, do you want £20 now or £30 in 2 weeks? They'll say, I have £20 now, even though, you know, it would be more valuable to have it later, because the temporal discounting means that it's not as valuable further away. So those rewards might need to be further, closer to you, and more tangible. Are your values aligned with your job? That's a huge one that causes burnout because of the cognitive dissonance. Do you feel rewarded, treated fairly, supported in your community? Is your workload manageable? Do you feel in control? A lot of the burnout comes from a feeling of overwhelm and a feeling of lack of control. And then finally, can I eat better, sleep better, exercise to boost my performance? They're really boring, but they're so core to keeping motivated. And then just a tiny little plug that parental burnout is a big thing. So I'm working a lot now in the neuroscience of preventing parental burnout, trying to understand what's going on in the brain, the conditions that mean that a lot of parents are burning out. And for that, I produce some team guides, some child development guides, I do some bespoke consultancy, and then workshops to try to help prevent this, because we know that a lot of parents end up getting burnt out because of the demands of both their job and their childcare. And so with that, please do feel free to ask any questions.
Thank you. I have a question. How long for burnout does recovery take? I know it can range, but there are a lot of people that it's almost like their lasting effects, and particularly in the workplace, they want to go for another job, but it's almost like there's some trauma associated too.
Yeah, hugely. Yeah, very much depends on the physiological effects of the burnout. So if you've had a strong stress response, it can take longer. And just changing the conditions, so just getting another job without addressing some of what's already gone by might not help. One of the big things I see in burnout recovery is a lot of like supplements and things that will reduce like cortisol. In general, those things don't work, because unless you address the situations that cause the stress, it's not going to change that. It's really hard to put a time on it, just because people vary so much in their resilience, their physiological responses. You know, some people have acute stress response that means that they will, you know, be ill more often, or they'll have problems with their heart. Other people will just ride it out for like 20 years and then it'll hit them because their body's just accumulated the stress for that long. So yeah, a large amount of it is genetics, physiology, resilience, psychological safety, things like that.
One other question. So I've managed quite a bit of Gen Z folks, and I noticed there are different thresholds, and I've hired people that aren't even a year out of college, and they use the term burnt out. They say they're burnt out. And it's really challenging for me to fully wrap my head around that. because if you look at their hours, it's not extensive. So I'm not, I guess my question is, since if there are different thresholds for people who manage people and are rising leaders, so a lot of Gen Zers, what is an effective way to kind of like proactively mitigate burnout and also deal with them? Because it can also be in some ways a very subjective definition of what it is.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that is really difficult. I think the core thing is that there's something that is, so quite often people label things that might not be the kind of clinical definition, but usually it's a kind of red flag for something. So there are toolboxes and things that you can use to assess levels of burnout. So it might be the case that you give your employees some kind of tools to allow them to assess where they are relative to things. This is quite a common thing in like all neurological, like people will think that they're very depressed, or they're, even physiologically, it's hard to know where you are relative to actual clinical symptoms, right? So you can use, there are toolboxes that I can give you links to those that allow you to assess where you are relatively. There's probably some red flag there. Like generally people are not on the path to burnout. They have no reason to suggest that they are, if you see what I mean. Like maybe there's subtle things that could be easily corrected that will prevent later burnout, or that will give them more perspective on where they are in that threshold. I don't know if that's helpful. I'll give you some tools.
Well, yeah, and
I
if
apologize for.
Oh, David, I'm
Sorry,
sorry. I was just going to add on very briefly, if I may, Michelle. I think the key, Ashley, what I loved about what you brought up is recognizing, and then you mentioned, Michelle, the psychological safety piece. And I think part of the conversation really does hinge on, creating these environments and cultures where we can have these conversations. And, I think some of the overwhelm, stress, burnout comes from perhaps starting to feel those early warning signs. There's a mismatch maybe in expectations, or even, hey, the goals keep changing and I'm not sure why. And so I think it's about, also fostering the environment where people can bring those things and there can be those micro course corrections versus letting it accumulate over time. And so I love, Ashley, it sounds like you are, so on it as a people leader to be aware and to be, seeking resources. And I love this conversation because I think that's really the key is, how can we create that transparency and enable people to bring what they're feeling, not just about the work product, the workload, but also, how it feels, the experience of, moving through a month or a quarter in that.
Yeah, and sometimes it's really simple things, right? Like, because you can take these toolkits and you can get a sense of where people are on these different factors, right? So maybe it actually is the workload's fine, and the value match is fine, but I actually don't feel like I have enough autonomy. So there is like a simple fix to have somebody who's identifying themselves as burnt out to just come in and be like, look, you have autonomy over this thing. And immediately their motivation's up because they have this feeling of like, okay, I'm in control here. And then you're, preventing this burnout that might happen.
I have to jump off in a minute, but I was just wondering, and I apologize for coming in a little late, in case you already touched on it, are there any specific industries or titles or roles where you see more burnout? I'm in healthcare, and I just got an email from a faculty who mentioned burnout. So I was just wondering, if there's any science or thought around that.
Yeah, absolutely. There are, yeah. I mean, healthcare is right on top there because, that is basically one where you have a complete values match usually, but the system is completely mismatched with, your workload is much more than you can expect to be able to achieve, because certainly in the UK, where you have the NHS is under so much burden, then people are working so much more than they physically can, even though their values are completely matched, so they burn out. And then, yeah, emotional high stress environments. It's yeah, I actually would say healthcare is one of the top. Academics as well. Interestingly, you have a number of industries where there's not like a labeled burnout because stigma is so high, like finance tends to be one. But the physiological effects of burnout and chronic stress mean that it's like sort of delayed to later, where you're just going to deal with those problems anyway. Increased heart, like strokes, heart disease, cardiovascular, cerebrovascular risk factors, all of that. But technically, there is no career, no job that is immune from it, because you only need a couple of those things to go off. Like even if you're voluntary work, even if you're a parent, you know, it can happen.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
Just going back to that decision-making process that you were talking about, I could see myself going through that many times. Is there some kinds of, you know, recommended tactics or practices to kind of interrupt your normal and get yourself through it so that you don't quit now and say, oh, every excuse to not do the thing that you ought to be doing?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, there is. So actually around New Year's, I always like put out loads of stuff about this because, you know, everyone's New Year's resolutions are like vast and like life-changing. And in fact, because decision making is cognitively expensive, like it's hard for your brain to make decisions, which is why when you're tired, you make poor decisions. So or you're you know, when you have instincts that need filling, your decision making becomes very bad. So the most important thing for good habits is habits, right? So remove decision making from the equation. So for that, you need to just have, like, if you think of the best habits you have, like brushing your teeth, it is something that is triggered by, it's time for bed, I brush my teeth before I go to bed. And that you never have to think about it. You never have to make a decision. You're not sitting there going, oh, actually, no. You just do it. So you need to build habits in like that. So say it's like, oh, I want to be motivated to go for a run every day. I need to remove all decision making from this. I can't say I'm going to do it every day because I need to know when it's going to be. Otherwise, I've got option generation where I go, oh, okay, maybe I'll do it after lunch. I'll do it. No decision making. My trainers are there, I put on my clothes, I go out the door. It's the same time every single day, or the same time twice a week, whatever it is, it's the same thing. I'm not going to go, I'm going to exercise twice a week. It's like, this is the thing that I do, and I build it into a habit so that my brain does not have to think about it at all. And then you also have to give yourself time, because if you're very effort sensitive, then things like, I always use exercise because it's very obviously effort based, but the same works for anything psychological. You have to increase the reward for the effort. So maybe it's like, okay, if I go for a run today, I'm going to treat myself to like this thing. Like it doesn't have to be very big, or maybe it's literally just like a star on a chart that's like, yeah, I did it. Well done me. And then the other thing to completely avoid at all costs is shame. Like a lot of people, especially when you're trying to build a new habit, if you don't manage to do that thing, you feel shame, and then you go in a circle of like, oh well, what's the point? I didn't do it this week, so I'm never going to be running. What's the point? And then that shame cycle makes you just not do it, and it never comes. So yeah, remove any kind of decision making your brain has to do, and just make it as much of a habit as you can. One thing at a time. Could take anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks to an entire year for a habit to be properly formed. So don't give up too easily on it. And if you fail on it, no shame. Just try again a little bit until it becomes a habit.
Makes sense, thanks.
What else? Any other questions? I have a few that I'll throw into the mix, but want to hear from attendees before I launch in, if that's okay.
I have a question related to, so I'm actually in a situation where I definitely was feeling very burnt out and left my job, and now I'm fearful about falling into that same pattern. And I really like what was on the screen earlier about the values piece and connecting your personal values to the organization. Do you have any tips about how to actually know that the company stands by their values? I feel like it's easy to, throw that up on a website, but then depending on the company and what team you're on, they might not actually have those values in place that might really respect employees' well-being and want to do something to help and prevent burnout.
Oh, that is, yeah, really, really good question. It's really, really difficult. I think, yes, a lot of it's so hard to cut through people just saying stuff. Most of the time you get a feeling for a mismatch. You can also directly like check these things, right? Like if it's very important to you that a company is environmentally friendly, then you can check those things and assess against whether you think that is. And then key to that is to try to make changes. And if those changes are repeatedly stopped, then you know that there's probably a value mismatch. One of the really difficult things in large organizations is that you might have a really good team culture, but the culture of the wider organization doesn't fit. And it's going to eventually, if it's something that is a core value for you, it's not gonna sit. I would really encourage you, there's a organization, I forget their actual name now. Common Values, that's it. I say Common Cause Foundation. I'm just going to drop this in the chat. So they have a values map, and that's along psychological criteria for values. And essentially, you will find that some values are at odds with the others, and this is a large cause of cognitive dissonance. So you can kind of work towards, they've got really great resources for working towards mapping your values so that you can be really clear, because a lot of people aren't actually very, very clear. And I talk about this a lot in parenting, that, when you're raising your kids, you're like, oh, I want my kids to be really successful. But I also want them to have all of these particular values, like want them to be financially stable, but then I also want them to be things that are kind of at odds. Like, I want you to be the best in the class, but also I don't care about how you do academically as long as you're happy. And those things are just constantly at odds. And so it's just like a nightmare for kids to learn. But it's the same for us, unless we've really clearly articulated our values and understood where they stand relative to others, then it's actually quite hard to hold a company to account to those values, right? Because you're never going to be perfect. So what matters the most?
I have something to add to that too. I think that if you, Lacey, are going through an interviewing process and you want to validate that what they say are their values they're living by, I would encourage asking directly to everyone that you meet, give me examples of how you're environmentally friendly or how you help support your staff with X, Y, Z, whatever it is that you felt akin to when you read their values and you thought, wow, this resonates with me. I'd like to be a part of an organization that prioritizes this. Ask them to give you examples of how they do that, because then it brings it to life. And if people can't tell you that, then clearly they're not living it.
Oh, I agree with that so much. I absolutely love that. Yeah, definitely. I saw somebody saying about how, because you get these kind of competency-based questions, that you should be using those in interviews to say, yeah, exactly, I'm going to need a specific example of it. And if you can't give it, then you obviously don't care or you've never thought about it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I would also encourage, to the extent possible, if you have any connections to people outside of that interview group, or you know someone that can introduce you to someone, you can do just like companies do reference checks. You can also, potentially try to check in and just do a little bit more digging to see even outside of, and it might be a great team. I love that point, Michelle. It might be a really awesome team dynamic culture, but the ability to kind of look wider beyond that and see, does the broader organization match up with the team I'd potentially be joining? You can kind of do some background checks yourself.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one because there's also like yeah, I totally get that resistance of like I remember when I was in academia, I was in a really, really toxic lab. And I spoke to a lot of people who'd come from really toxic lab cultures, and they just didn't want to go to another lab because they were like, I just don't ever want to go through that again. And like, no, it's not everyone. Like once you've been through it once, it's really like, I just don't ever want to go through that again. But there are ways to protect yourself from that. And even if it is protecting yourself, like it's like, I'll engage in this, but I'm not going to let this drip into my social life, my personal life. This is my 9 to 5 job that I do, and I leave it at home. I leave it at work.
Well, that's a great, I'll jump in there. That's a great maybe thing to pivot off of. How do you do that? That's really hard. I think earlier in my career, there was a lot of, all right, leave it, boundary. I'm going to leave that in my 9 to 5. But then, the reality is it kind of creeps in, and, we're thinking about it, or we're running through those to-do lists. So I'd love to get your thoughts just from like a brain neuroscience standpoint. Are there any rituals that you would recommend, end of day, end of week, ways that we can sort of create that boundary so we're not letting it seep into home life?
I think that really comes back down to really strongly articulating your values, right? The only reason that you give, like, I think of when I was in academia, the reason I left academia is because I sat down, I went to a career kind of development course, and it was amazing. And you literally just had to sit down and map, what are your values? What are your passions? What are your interests? Put all of that down, clear as day, and then assess, is what I'm doing aligned with this? And to me, it was so clear that it wasn't. And the reason I didn't have boundaries is because I had thought without clearly articulating what it was I wanted. So I'd just been completely on this track. I just want to be a professor. I just want to be a professor. That's all I did. That's all I care about. So I'm working myself into the ground to get to this goal, where I've actually not actually assessed at all, does it actually match my values and what I want? And it didn't at all. So I was repeatedly burning out because I had no boundaries, because I was getting to this goal that didn't actually fit with what I wanted. So I think that is probably the most powerful thing you can do. But ritual wise, yeah, I think you will set your rituals up based on those boundaries aligning with your values, right? Like, it's important for me to come home and, spend time with my kids. I say at 6 o'clock when my kids are downstairs. But, normally, then that should be a boundary for you.
Amazing. I love that. I love that. Any other questions from the group? I think in the spirit of your kids being downstairs, Michele, maybe we can wrap. We covered a lot of what I had prepared, and we just covered so much ground. So thank you for your time. Any other last questions before we hop off?
Thank you. That's been really helpful.
Oh, great. Fantastic. Feel free to get in touch if you have any questions, or you want to know anything more, or if you want any resources.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alison.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. I will share the recording and just kind of summarize a couple of the resources that were discussed. And Michele, thank you again for your time. So appreciate it. And I hope you have a great evening.
Thanks. Bye.
Take care, everyone.